Treasury doubles debt buybacks as Bessent moves to steady bond market. The department is increasing purchases of older, longer-dated government debt at a moment when investors are sensitive to yield swings and auction demand. Reuters, CNBC, Axios, The Financial Times, and The Guardian all described the announcement as an attempt to support smoother trading conditions after yields reacted lower. A buyback can help liquidity by giving dealers another predictable buyer for securities that may trade less easily than newly issued bonds. It does not erase the federal borrowing need, and it does not settle the inflation or deficit debate behind the rates market. Secretary Scott Bessent's immediate test is whether scheduled operations calm strain without signaling panic about demand for public debt. The consumer link is indirect but real, because Treasury yields feed mortgage rates, corporate borrowing costs, portfolio values, and state budget choices. Traders will watch operation sizes, dealer participation, auction tails, and whether long yields keep falling after the first response. A calm result would support the market function argument, while renewed volatility would raise questions about whether the purchases are large enough. The next record is the dated operation notice and following auction result, with dealers checking whether liquidity improves across older bonds, not just the newest benchmark issues, across trading desks too. Trump scaling down U.S. South Korea drills risks more than just joint military readiness. Washington and Seoul are reducing the length and scope of exercises after the president's order, according to Reuters, CNBC, and CNN reports on alliance planning. Military drills are not only rehearsals, they are signals to adversaries, reassurance to allies, and tests of whether command systems work under pressure. A smaller exercise can reduce short-term political friction with Pyongyang, but it can also leave commanders with less recent practice coordinating air, naval, cyber, and ground responses. South Korea must decide whether the change is tactical flexibility or evidence that American commitments are becoming more conditional. The risk for Washington is that other partners read the same signal and hedge against a less predictable security guarantee. The risk for Seoul is that deterrence relies on visible readiness, not only treaty language. None of the reports prove an alliance rupture, and a revised drill can preserve core capabilities if planners protect the hardest tasks and keep senior commanders involved. The public benchmark is the next joint communique, exercise calendar, and any North Korean response. Those records will show whether this is a limited adjustment or a lasting posture shift for forces, diplomats, and regional governments watching deterrent signals and command credibility in Asia this week. Trump nominates Heidi Overton to lead U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Al Jazeera, NBC News, The Washington Post, and The New York Times report that the president selected a White House aide for one of the government's most consequential health regulation jobs. The commissioner oversees drug approvals, food safety, medical devices, tobacco rules, inspections, and emergency responses, so the nomination is about much more than one personnel move. The immediate question is what qualifications, policy priorities, and conflict of interest disclosures appear in the file sent to the Senate. Review can test how the nominee would handle vaccines, trial standards, abortion-related drugs, nutrition policy, recalls, inspections, and industry lobbying. Supporters may emphasize White House trust and management alignment. Critics are likely to ask whether scientific independence would be protected when evidence conflicts with political pressure. Agency credibility depends on decisions being seen as evidence-based even when elected officials set direction. Industry groups will watch approval speed and enforcement style, while patient advocates watch safety standards. The public stake is whether regulatory confidence rises or weakens during contested decisions. The next concrete records are paperwork, committee questions, hearing date, financial disclosures, ethics agreements, vote count signals, and any written commitments about staff science, recalls, inspections, and enforcement across high-stakes decisions affecting patients, food producers, device makers, and inspectors this month. Former Fauci advisor Dr. David Morens pleads guilty to concealing COVID-related records. NPR, The New York Times, and NBC News report that the former federal health official admitted conduct tied to preserving and disclosing pandemic-era communications. The case matters because public records rules are how reporters, Congress, historians, and citizens reconstruct government decision-making after an emergency. A plea can resolve individual criminal exposure while leaving broader questions about agency document practices, email channels, and oversight culture. The key distinction is between what Morens admitted, what prosecutors can prove about intent, and whether any wider policy failure gets documented. For health agencies, the credibility issue is not only one official's punishment, it is whether scientific and administrative deliberations remain available for lawful review. Lawmakers may use the case to press for stricter retention rules, while defenders may argue that one plea should not rewrite the pandemic record. The public should watch the sentencing memo, factual statement, any cooperation terms, and agency preservation guidance. Those documents will show whether the case stays narrow or becomes a larger accountability fight over records, transparency, and trust in health institutions. The next court filing is the practical benchmark for penalties, document retention reforms, oversight hearings, and any sworn explanation of how messages were handled inside federal systems during today's public review. Fed officials saw need for rate hike if inflation doesn't cool, minutes show. Reuters says, CNBC says, and AP News says the central bank's July meeting record showed increased concern about price pressure and the possibility of more restraint if progress stalls. Minutes matter because they reveal the range of views behind a policy decision, not only the final vote. The important distinction is conditional language. Policymakers were not saying another increase is automatic, but that persistent inflation could require a tighter stance. That matters for households and businesses because expectations for future borrowing costs shape mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, payroll plans, and investment decisions before the next meeting. Markets will parse whether the concern came from many officials or a smaller group. They will compare the document with incoming inflation, jobs, and wage data to judge whether the committee's center has shifted. A rise would aim to cool demand, but it also raises the risk of slower growth, tighter credit, and weaker hiring. Holding steady would ease that pressure only if prices keep moving toward target. The next records are inflation readings, public remarks, updated projections, and the next policy statement, especially language on services prices, wages, rent, consumer demand, and dissenting votes, household spending, and credit conditions from officials and investors today. After Lala's flooding, another storm or hurricane could hit Hawaii this weekend. The Washington Post, USA Today, and NBC News report that forecasters are watching a new tropical threat after flooding and power outages already strain the islands. The immediate danger is not a single dramatic landfall forecast. It is the combination of saturated ground, damaged infrastructure, and limited island logistics if another system brings heavy rain or wind. A weaker system can become more hazardous when roads, drainage, shelters, and utilities have not recovered from the previous event. Residents need official watches and warnings, not social media rumor, because track and intensity forecasts can shift quickly near Hawaii. Emergency managers will focus on flood-prone areas, power restoration, harbor and airport operations, and whether shelters have capacity. The public risk concerns include blocked roads, unsafe water, heat in homes without power, and delayed medical access for older residents in isolated communities. Preparedness means checking supplies, medicine, fuel, family contacts, charging options, evacuation routes, pet plans, and official maps before alerts become urgent. The next records are national weather service advisories, county notices, utility updates, shelter decisions, rainfall forecasts, road closures, harbor status, airport operations and restoration timetables, medical access, water safety, debris removal, school closures, fuel supply, and neighbor check-ins for every island county this week statewide. In new filings, Kennedy Center says it won't try to put Trump's name on facade until September 8th. NPR and PBS report that lawyers told the court the arts complex will not pursue the disputed building name change before the early September deadline. The immediate point is procedural, but the dispute also involves presidential branding, board authority, donor confidence, and public stewardship of a national cultural institution. A pause can lower short-term tension without deciding who controls signage, renovation choices, or the public message attached to the building. The court record matters because it separates legal commitments from political statements, fundraising appeals, and speculation about the facade. For Representative Joyce Beatty and other challengers, timing affects whether a judge can rule before physical changes or public events make the fight harder to unwind. For the center, the filing can preserve flexibility while avoiding an emergency order. Visitors, donors, performers, and arts groups will watch whether governance questions distract from programming and maintenance. The next records are the September deadline. Any revised signage plan, board minutes, fundraising communications, further court orders, renovation notices, and statements from parties, visitor notices, performer communications, and budget documents from advocates and management this month publicly. Those materials will show whether the pause becomes a settlement path or only a temporary delay. Israel opens criminal investigation into killings of Hind, Rajab, and Gaza medical workers. Reuters, The New York Times, Al Jazeera, and AP report that the Israeli military acknowledged troops fired on the car carrying the 5-year-old and opened a probe. The central issue is accountability for a widely reported incident involving a child and rescuers, not merely whether an internal file exists. A criminal investigation should establish the sequence of calls, vehicle movements, targeting decisions, command approvals, and rescue attempts. It should identify what soldiers knew at the time and whether rules of engagement were followed. Families, aid groups, and governments will judge the process by independence, access to evidence, and whether findings are published. The case carries wider stakes because humanitarian workers need credible protection to operate in Gaza, and civilians need confidence that distress calls are not ignored or misread. An inquiry can uncover wrongdoing, clear specific personnel, or expose procedural failures. The label alone does none of those things. Transparency also affects diplomatic pressure, because allies and courts assess whether military accountability systems can investigate themselves. The next records are prosecutor updates, witness accounts, forensic material, communications logs, vehicle evidence, command reviews, and any disciplinary or criminal decision, plus any public explanation of investigative independence before families receive documented answers publicly soon. UAE severs trade with Iran after reported missile strike. The Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs, Reuters, CNBC, and Al Jazeera reported a freeze or embargo tied to missile threat concerns and renewed regional tension. The first question is scope. Trade can mean direct goods, financial channels, shipping services, re-exports, or specific sanctioned entities. Each category creates a different economic effect for companies using Gulf ports, banks, insurers, and energy routes. The UAE has long balanced commercial links with security concerns, so a sudden cutoff would be a significant signal if formalized. It could also be narrower than the first reports if exemptions remain for humanitarian goods, existing contracts, or indirect transactions. Markets will look at oil prices, shipping advisories, insurance premiums, and bank compliance notices before the diplomatic picture is fully clear. Iran's response matters because retaliation or threats around waterways can spread costs beyond the two countries. The public should treat initial reports as a trigger for verification, not as a complete legal map for compliance teams, shippers, or households watching prices. The next records are customs instructions, central bank notices, company updates, Tehran statements, maritime security bulletins, port guidance, insurer memos, sanctions notices, and fuel market reactions, shipping route changes, bank screening standards, contract notices, and regional diplomacy signals across Gulf commercial channels today regionally. Israeli army launches criminal probe into killing of 5-year-old Hind Rajab in Gaza. Reuters, France 24 NPR, and Al Jazeera report that the military opened a case after acknowledging fire connected to the child's death and the medics sent to rescue her. This overlaps with another report today, but the additional sourcing underscores how central the incident has become to scrutiny of wartime conduct. The practical question is whether prosecutors can reconstruct events from radio traffic, phone recordings, location data, vehicle damage, medical records, and testimony. A credible probe must determine who authorized fire, whether the car was identified, what information was available about civilians inside, and why rescue workers could not prevent the deaths. The outcome matters for the family, for aid agencies operating under fire, and for governments assessing compliance with humanitarian law. Opening a criminal file is a procedural step. It is not a finding of guilt, innocence, or reform. The risk is that a closed process deepens mistrust even if investigators collect evidence. Public findings also matter for future rescue protocols and for soldiers deciding how to treat civilian vehicles. The next meaningful update would be charges, discipline, a timeline release, or a public explanation if none follows, with evidence access for families and outside reviewers before international scrutiny moves on.